So first and foremost, can you tell us the hierarchy of entities, et cetera, et cetera?
All of them? Just the whole mess?
Yeah, let's start at the top.
All right,
Who's
so
at the top?
just a bit of preface and pontification. Kingdom Death lore is soft as we explore it, and once things filter their way down into being actual content is when things get like very, very well defined. So, there may be moments where I ask you to stop so we can edit something out because I've said too much. Just letting you guys know too that I'm trying to be very careful because I don't want to spoil anything that's major. Because we are kind of like all on this journey together, you guys as fans and me as the creator, as we continue to expand the world. So, entities.
Right. Entities. Let's start with the entities.
All right. So, Kingdom Death is a world made of monsters, and that's pretty much it. Monsters, however, kind of end up being all the races. So, the survivors are monsters. The greater beings are also monsters. There's really only one type of race in monster, one species. It's all monster, if that makes any sense at all. That doesn't mean that there aren't higher things, and there aren't things that are, quote unquote, god-like, but even the gods are still flesh and mortal and can die like everything else.
The gods are flesh and blood. That means there's no spirits, no supernatural.
No. Kingdom Death originally started out as a game project, supposed to be hero-based and dungeon crawl, but we got away from that. And I wanted to take some of the things I love the most about, the genre and the tropes in general and not touch them. Like, I'm a huge undead fan, cool-ass old warriors and whites that are, animated bones and liches and necromancers. I love all that stuff, but I didn't want to do it. I wanted to see kind of like where else we could push. So there's no supernaturals, there's no ghosts, there's no vampires, there's no werewolves, there's no mummies, all that stuff we've seen and love, trying to stay away from it as we develop and move forward. And that, when you restrict yourself creatively, that's to end up with things like, oh yeah, let's do a dung beetle night. I've never seen that before. And, if you're playing well, you can crush it and kill it. It's not an immortal being, it cannot resurrect itself. It is not animated bones. Speaking of which, as much as I love skeletons, they make zero sense. Like, if you were a master of magic, right, would you really spend that much time trying to get a human skeletal system to be able to articulate and animate? Like, no, you'd just be like, shit, if I can do this, I'm just gonna go float a bunch of swords over at my enemies. Right? Doesn't make, it's cool, it doesn't make any sense. So in Kingdom Death, I'm always trying to, in the background, have things make sense, and then, it ends up with a lot of very strange scientific explanations. And then we take that, and then we start to actually build the content, and then we kind of like pull those very dry explanations back and put it from the survivor's point of view, because that's the player's point of view. And that's how you end up, I hope, with something that feels deep and seems like it makes sense, even though the concepts are alien.
Right. So let's get a little more granular on some of the stuff. So as the gameplay starts to come out, you start to flesh it out. So let's talk Abyssal Woods.
Yeah.
So how fleshed out are the Abyssal Woods? Let's start in the center. What's at the center of the Abyssal Woods?
So the Abyssal Woods is a concept I had a long time ago when I was first sketching out like what would be in the world/universe. And it is a forest, but the strange thing there is that there's a black hole in the center. And the black hole is not always active. It kind of like pulses, and its strength will change over the period of time. So then I started to think about, well, all right, if there's something in the center of this thing that's constantly trying to pull it inward, that means that all the trees and plant life are all bent towards the center part. And any of the things that were too weak have been pulled in long ago. So these trees will end up with like these crazy, ridiculous gnarled roots that of course look like giant hands, because, that's the best thing to hold on to things in Kingdom Death. And then it means all of the things that live there also need a way that when this thing really picks up to latch themselves down. That's why when you look at the Disciples of the Witch, they all have these cloaks, which is like this weird living fabric, which is more than likely probably an actual living thing. And when the wind picks up, it just like, starts to grab onto things nearby so they don't get sucked off.
Right, and they have a specific job in the Abyssal Woods, correct?
They do. So the Flower Witch is kind of like, the Abyssal Woods is sort of like a weird, no, city's not the right word because it's woods, but it's like extremely densely populated, and it's separated into like different seasons, similar to like we'd have here. But the seasons are chaotic, and these things kind of like overlap each other. So the witch who's in the center of it is kind of like the main governing force in ensuring that none of the other basically things that live here get too powerful and start to throw everything out of whack. Throw things too far out of whack, the thing in the center is going to suck the whole thing in and it's going to be done. So they have this like bizarre net set up so that when things get sucked in, they get caught in this net. And then they have to go and clean it. And I'd love to make like a tower defense sort of game based around that theme where you're like playing as them and you're dealing with it. But that's like, perhaps another time.
Right, another time.
Yeah.
So in the art, the Disciples of the Witch, their clothing almost looks like Wailing Smoke, but that's not the case, right?
No, it's definitely, the intent was to have it to be some sort of living fabric. We haven't exactly fleshed out what that is yet, but we will once we get into working on the Abyssal Woods. That's part of the joy. Is like you start with the concept, and then you get to like do research and find things in reality that are similar, and start to go, oh, maybe it's actually this or that, and that's when things start to get interesting.
So let's bounce to Wailing Smoke.
Yeah.
So where is Wailing Smoke? Where's it originate?
So there are 3 areas that I started to work on at the very beginning of all this, before there was Monster. The Holy Lands, which was built as basically like a, let's say level 1 to 3 place that heroes might adventure, right? So you have like a hierarchy of monsters you might typically see in a dungeon, which it was at the time. You have the Holy Landers, and then you have the heavy versions of the Holy Landers, and you have the blacksmiths, and then you have the knights and the knight captain, and above them you start to get into the mothers and the grandmothers, and then you have the chosen and the blessed one, and then the forge god and the wet nurse, and all of these things together make up what is this area. And I start to think like, okay, well, why are all these human-shaped monsters working in concert? What's going on here? It's like, oh, well, obviously the wet nurse is feeding all of these human babies. It's, hormone nightmare milk, whatever you want to call it. And it's making it so that these things basically have like a, it's almost like insect worker mentality. So this is what happens to them. You end up with all of these Holy Landers, which, especially if it's supposed to be like a sprawling, beautiful city, are master craftsmen, right? So their weapons are hammers and things they used to build stuff with, and they're probably constantly toiling away, and they sleep in big ditches and just eat whatever like is provided for them. So the Wailing Smoke in specific, the mothers, who basically have that like cool furnace stomach, they're the things that give birth to whatever is inside the knight's armors, right? And then they're also, the grandmothers are what give birth to the chosen and the blessed ones. The Wailing Smoke is a byproduct of this process. It's kind of like what you end up with residual, or when you have something that totally F's up. So the Wailing Smoke is basically like all over the Holy Lands. And it's like, is it sentient? What's it up to? We're not 100% sure yet, but when we get there, we'll probably figure out what it is. Like, maybe it is a strange cluster of insects or bacteria. Haven't quite decided yet, but that's kind of like how the development process goes. We have like a broad stroke, and as we get into the details, especially once rules are assigned, we're like, oh, wouldn't it be more interesting if it was actually this? And then once we know that, we pull it back and just hint at it.
Okay. So let's talk geography a little bit, because
yes.
So I don't even know how to word this. How big is the plane of faces?
Good question. Geography is murky, and there's a very good reason for that, and it is way too spoilery. But there is a definitive, concrete reason why.
So we will find out.
There is why the place is impossible to map, besides the fact that Watchers are constantly eating human history, right? Or survivor history. And then there's another reason behind that, why the place is impossible to like kind of make a topography of, but it's too spoilery, unfortunately.
And so Watchers, plural.
Yeah.
So there's more than one Watcher.
Of course. I mean, think of all the people who are playing
right.
AD,
Everybody's
right?
making their own story. Overwhelming darkness.
Yes.
Measure of time or place?
It was always intended to be like, imagine if you've traveled so far from your settlement, you get to the point where you've just been in darkness for so long that you just like kind of like freak out. But upon revisiting it with 1.5 things, we realized that it's more like a barrier. It's like a thing. It's an area that is intensely dark that light has trouble penetrating, which means it's probably just like the atmosphere is just incredibly dense. You start to ask yourself questions like, well, why is it denser here? And then it starts to become more and more interesting.
Right.
And at 1.5, we have in the new table, there's a little bit of hints as to what's going on in there, but it leaves us more area to explore and develop on later. Maybe just leave it. If we describe things too precisely, all it is offering spoilers as to all the stuff that's out there. And it's better to, leave things so that we can come back to it and develop it more later, especially because part of the experience is shared, and it allows the players at the table to have that discussion of what's going on, as opposed to us just being like, no, it's like this.
Right. So we've established there's multiple watchers eating human history.
Yep.
How about scribes?
It's only one scribe.
Only one scribe.
Only one scribe.
How about a king?
The multiple kings.
Multiple kings.
Yeah.
And do they have their own set of underlings? Hands?
Oh man. So you guys don't know anything about the king and all that stuff at all. Okay.
They await the king, right?
Right. All right. So I can talk about this a little bit because it was pretty developed. I can't tell you the reasons behind things, but essentially the Kingsmen lead kings around with their lantern helmets. So imagine kind of like dots in the darkness that these things follow. The kings are strange. They're not quite all there. And when they're led to one of the settlements, they just... I'm just trying to figure out how spoiled. I mean, everyone knows you're going to fight this thing. Yeah.
Right.
So when it gets to this settlement, it just tries to devour you for whatever reason. So why it's trying to devour you, and then why the Kingsmen do this, and why the Hand has set all this up is part of the narrative arc that was going to be the Lantern Festival.
So is there an interplay directly between Watchers and the King then?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, not the King, but the scribe who set the scenario up. Yeah.
Okay.
Watchers are kind of like pimples on the land.
Okay.
Right. There are these things that, in a way, infect the land. Like the Watcher Cavern is spherical. Most of it's underground, and as it's in there sleeping or festering, however we want to call it, it's pushing these lanterns up to the surface, which create the lantern horde. 1.5 starts to hint at what the lanterns might actually look like, but we didn't want to just spell that out.
Right.
You know what I mean? It's to us they look like lanterns, but maybe they're not quite lanterns. Why do they look like that? Are they called lanterns? Because they're not fire-based. There's no fire in the world yet. It's all just bioluminescent. Now is it basically if humans had access to light and heat, how quickly would they develop fire?
Right.
And I don't know. So we're sort of rolling with that so far.
So speaking of quickly, we're talking units of time.
Yep.
Everybody wants to know how long a lantern year is. So is it a specific measurement of time, or is it a measurement of perception?
It started as a measurement of time, but I eroded that. So canon, it's been eroded.
Okay.
Originally it was any time between 2 to 10 years could be a lantern. So they're originally they were called lantern decades.
Okay.
And then I found the word for what a unit of 5 would be, and I was like, this just sounds too stupid. They're just lantern years. It's fine. But when you get into the territory of measuring them accurately, you end up kind of being oh, well, all these children are out fighting, and then all these children are reproducing, and that's not kind of an area. That's not where we want players to focus their attention on.
Right.
Decided to let's just obscure that. So there is not an accurate measure of time for that, and that's very much on purpose.
Okay.
Because another way you can look at it is, lantern years are tracked by how long it takes a lantern to burn out when it's set aside from the horde. How long does that take? I don't know. It could be a few years.
Right. So then, why do survivors only age if they're actively hunting?
Age is another one of those obscure points.
Again, we're thinking about it wrong, probably. My frame of reference is wrong for age then.
Well, we've tied age to both how old we're looking at someone and how much experience they have.
Right.
Right? So, who's to say that a survivor who's been in the settlement since year 1 goes out at year 15 and then suddenly starts to age. Like, who's to say they've stopped aging? Like, in my attempts to make like a narrative or a comic book out of it, like in the notes we're keeping track of what's happening and who's going. So just because, like, you know, someone could still have their birthday even though they've never been out hunting. It's kind of like one and the same. And then to the survivors, like the importance of who can hunt and who's doing what is all there is. Like, in a way, who cares how old you are if you don't have any actual hunting experience?
So it's more of a measure of building up and then wearing down of their physicality in the world?
Absolutely. The interesting question from there is then what's happening with the Phoenix, right? Is it just physically aging them, or is it sending them forward through their lifetime?
And the same with saviors when they disappear into the dream, correct?
Right. Because that's, like, again, in that complicated area of time-space, you know, kingdom, death, time-space.
Right. Is there a barrier or something preventing, say, survivors that wake up with ink on their eyes from trekking to the Holy Lands? Or...
I think that's too much in the spoiler territory.
Damn it.
Sorry. There is definitely something, and it makes sense in the scope of everything. And it's not something lame like survivors are part slug and they can't cross the copper wire.
Right. And for people that don't know, there's a reason maps don't exist, right?
Well, first of all, human history is constantly being eroded by watchers. So, like, if a settlement, here's a good piece of information. If a settlement is left dormant for too long, and for some reason there is a watcher who isn't just in its hibernation mode, it will come and just devour all the history there. They'll erode statues and get rid of everything. So there's almost no trace of it left. That's why when you find ruins in the game in the settlement event, they're usually just like blasted, complete mess. You're never like, oh, we walk into a settlement and things were okay. This guy gave me a lantern sword. It wasn't so bad. Spoke a language I didn't understand. Whatever.
So are people like the great game hunters, were they survivors that woke up, bested their watcher, and then managed to succeed?
It's possible.
Okay.
But I haven't fully developed what that is yet, so I don't know what the history of the one city in the world is yet.
Okay. But we're planning on seeing that.
Yeah, I'd love to get into it.
And then as far as a master design document, outside of what's in your head, we've seen the life cycle of some of the flora and fauna.
Yep.
Do you plan on laying that out in a easy to digest form and releasing more of that, or is that the only spoiler we're really going to get as far as that goes, and we'll have to suss it out through gameplay?
I mean, right now, sussing out through gameplay seems to be an extreme amount of fun for everyone. So, as the person leading the project, I feel like I'd be taking something away from everyone by doing it. You know, I think if we ever have like a guidebook or a lore book, it's because we're at the point of me running out of ideas / selling out. It's like, okay, we're done. Let's just explain everything and be over it.
Okay.
But yeah, and then like whenever I get into the idea of making it, I just get more excited about developing new things or fleshing out things that have only been hinted at, more so than just being like laying out what's there.
Right.
I mean, we have stuff for us internally, but I don't think you guys will see it.
So
sorry.
Don't expect to see it until you see #Poots sellout.
Yeah, it's true. But I think I promised a real big fish song with me slam dunking a bunch of cash into the bank account. Yeah.
So you have a tendency to want to play things really close to the chest and have unveil it as like an emergent narrative. Is that something that you discovered from the outset, or was that based on player feedback and how it felt to you guys as you were
Honestly, it was
developing
based on how the game felt when we were like early testing it. That was never the intent from the beginning, especially because there's not very many good examples of game experiences like that. It was just kind of like, you know, focusing the player group, these are a group of people playing this game, on what's important moment to moment. And then a lot of the like history of this, or you know, books that have like 3 pages describing a tapestry on a wall, like all that stuff just kind of fades in the background, because the point is to sit down with your friends, fight a monster, barely survive, get back to the settlement, scrape together, and figure out what you're going to do next. And so everything else just kind of got pushed to the side. So that means that all of the chunks of lore got minimized. And then once we looked at that, it just felt so much different. It's like, I can much better put myself in the position of these people struggling when I don't really know that much, or I only know as much as they do. It also gives you that sense of mastery and accomplishment as you go through the game and you go through the expansions and you learn more and you start to piece things together and you get those like aha moments. And those aha moments come naturally for us when we're developing things and we realize that things share a connection, or like we could do something really cool if we put this here and that there. And finding out ways to share that with the players I think it's amazing.
Right.
So it's definitely something that happened, like it emerged for us. So why not continue like allowing that emergent narrative to be like a core part of the experience?
Right, and then it gives the players, at least for us, my group's concerned, a sense of ownership almost over the story.
Yeah. Put the model, you build the models, you kit them out, you paint them, and then you have your experience there. I had a moment at Gen Con I went to before we even had a booth where a fan asked me a very specific question. I gave him an answer, and I just like watched the color drain from his face. It's just like, that is not what he thought. I don't know what he thought. Maybe it was amazing, maybe it was really silly, but that wasn't what he wanted to hear, and it just got me thinking about what is important for the experience. And the experience we have is not reading a lore book, and the experience we have is not reading Encyclopedia Death. The experience is playing the game and feeling like you're part of it. And this seems to be the best, I'd say the best kaleidoscope to look through to feel that. To feel that confusion and that panic and that sense of danger and urgency. We have like a lot of real things and then a lot of like random events sprinkled onto a game mechanics where some things are very obvious and clear, and then some things are kind of like hidden between the layers of the rules that take a little while to learn. When you get that, you're like, oh man, I understand this now. I can start being a part of it instead of just being on the sidelines. I think that's important. I mean, it seems to be doing well, so.
Originally you had 3 locations in mind. Can you explain what the third location was?
Right, this is back in 2007 when Kingdom of Death was just a mere twinkle in my eye. We had the Holy Lands, the Abyssal Woods, and the third was I wanted to do a continent that was missing. So imagine the whole continent is missing, and I guess in that case you just have water pouring into this hole. And then I was trying to think like, well, if that happened, why isn't all the water just draining or it fills up? And I thought it would be really cool to have like a bunch of bizarre civilizations that have like grown out along this wall. And they'd probably have a lot of water-powered stuff because the force of the water that's coming down. And then I started to imagine like, well, what kind of life lives down there? There'd have to be a lot of stuff that's good at both swimming upstream and floating, like some kind of weird ghost ocean. I don't even know. And that was a third area that I just never really got to. I don't know if we'll see that in Kingdom Death, but it's somewhere in the back of the head.
So that's different than the Rust Ocean, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Totally different.
So speaking of locations, Alan again wants to know, can you tease a location that nobody's ever heard of before?
I don't think anyone's heard of the Missing Continent.
Okay.
Missing Continent, Rust Ocean. I can't think of anything else off the top of my mind. There's a huge spoiler with how the topography works, but again, I can't get into it.
We won't go there.
Yeah.
If the Mad and Mighty Striker had a first name, what would it be?
It would be after you, Travis. There you go. So, I mean, the answer everyone wants to hear is, I will tell you nothing. You must piece everything together yourself. We know exactly what's happening behind every nook and cranny, and the ones we haven't, we will figure out, and we will sprinkle it all across the entire experience for you to find.
Perfect.
That's really, that's the sales pitch, right?
Right, yeah. But, I mean, anybody who's been
It's
following...
not really a sales pitch. It's just like, we want everyone to have fun with it and be able to experience it. And I just think show, not tell is the way to do things like this.
Right, and I think that, I can speak for probably everybody with that organic way that you've been doing things is working out. So we're looking forward to more.
So
are saviors unique to human monsters? Or is there a savior oblivion mosquito?
No, it's just peoples.
Okay.
Or whatever we're calling peoples, survivors.
Can you elaborate? So we're going to be seeing red witches.
Oh, and answer to the question, are survivors humans? The answer is, I don't know.
Okay.
To be fair.
Not as we know them anyway.
Right. Not yet to be revealed.
Okay.
I think that's something I really have to think about for a while. Because obviously they are what we play as, and they are our window into the game. They are us. But are they the same as us? I mean, look where they've evolved from. So I guess technically no.
Right.
Right? Just have to see.
Wait and see.
Anyway, your question.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the red witches?
Okay, so Red Witches, new expansion we're working on.
Right.
You ever hear of like, the witching cloak? That's sort of just like very basic fairy tale.
So basically it's evolved from the trope of the magic cloak.
Okay, so yeah, the Red Witches have evolved from the trope of a magic cloak that appears in fairy tales. Like sometimes it allows you to travel quickly, sometimes it protects you from dragon fire, sometimes it lets you change shape. It's like, it appears all the time, right? And so I wanted to sort of like do my own homage to that very heavy fairy tale thing. And so the Red Witches have this cloak that allows them to basically move. The most simple way to look at it is that they can swap places with anyone else who's wearing a cloak. What's really happening is much grosser than that, but that's like, for all intents and purposes, the easy way to explain it. So the Red Witches are basically the small part of the White Speakers that go deal with things that are a threat to the cult. And then there are also like threats that are too major for the other cult members to deal with. And then they also hunt down members of the cult who've gone rogue. And White Speakers who are in training are wearing these like all fully black sensory deprivation suits. And sometimes they end up being inducted by the Red Witches. So you'll end up with a bunch of these White Speakers in these red cloaks. They're just positioned all over the place so that the Red Witches can quickly switch between things and cover ground rapidly. So in the Red Witch expansion is the first time that we're going to meet them as players. And they are hunting down the Pariah, who's the last male White Speaker, for reasons that hopefully we will hint at and allow you guys to figure out in the expansion. I think that covers them in the most basic sense. You got to be pretty badass to be a Red Witch, and there's only ever 3, so one of them dies, it gets replaced.
So the special forces of the White Speakers, basically,
yeah,
who are already badass.
Right. So White Speakers' powers all come from stories and knowledge. So they're basically just equipped with different stories and different knowledge, which gives them power. The White Speaker basics are, they all basically know whatever story it is that makes you ageless, and they know whatever story it is that gives you the hypersensitivity. So they're, we talk about that in the core game.
Right.
Yeah.
I heard through the grapevine that you're actually packing in a lot more stuff into like the gambler's chest and things that backers aren't even going to know about, like little surprises and fun things. Is that true?
I'll never admit to that.
Never admit to that.
Never. We're already making too much stuff.
You're getting less than you paid for.
Are you kidding me?
Definitely not more.
That's not fair.
So a little more elaboration on the way time passes. The reason we don't know for sure is because the survivors themselves don't know, right?
Exactly. I mean, we're talking about Kingdom Death here, right? And if your survivors haven't innovated, that method of water and stones that people use to tell times, and they haven't innovated clocks, they don't have watches for sure, and there's no discernible patterns in the sky or in the darkness to tell them what time it is. The only thing that you do have in the game world is separating a lantern from the horde and timing how long it takes until it fades, and that is a lantern year. And that's all they have. I mean, maybe we'll introduce other innovations in the future that get more specific, but it makes sense to me.
Right. So obviously a lot of the lore comes to life as you're creating the gameplay to go with it.
Absolutely.
So the best way, really, other than this interview, the best way to get the lore is to go play and figure it out.
It's kind of like, you have just all this stuff out in the darkness, and then the content creating allows us to like pull things into focus and sort of like readjust it so that the little bits and pieces start to make sense when you line it up.
And there's a lot of darkness left to be filled, and
yeah,
you're gonna.
Thank you everyone for letting us continue to explore it. Like I really feel like it's been a journey for like everybody, me and the fans. Like the fans support the project, which allows us to move further and look at more and ask more questions like this and have answers for them. It's super cool.
Right on. We appreciate it. Thanks. That's it. You guys will know more. You'll be able to explore more gameplay if you haven't actually played the game when it ships later on this year. You'll be able to dive in and figure it out for yourself.
Cool.